Well, it's good to see everybody here on this cold morning today. So I'm proud of you guys for braving it and coming to church to hear a word from God this morning. And we're also so grateful for everybody tuning in online. And so if you're doing that, we welcome you as well. You know, I don't know if you're like me, but I don't like waiting. I hate waiting. I don't like waiting in line. And now that TikTok is gone, it's worse than ever. I don't know if you're like me, but like when you go into Walmart and you can't for whatever reason go into the self-checkout line, you have to go to one with a cashier. What do you do? Yeah, Liz, here, I'll tell you what I do. First of all, I'm going to look at how many people are in line, right? You're going to do that first, and then what's the next thing you look at? How many items are in their cart, right? So you're going to size that up. Then let's take it a step further. Then you got to look at the cashier, okay? You got to see, are they moving along? Are they taking their time? Are they a little talkative? What are we doing here? Are we keeping it strict to business, right? So and then finally you're going to look at the people checking out and you're going to say, okay, how likely are they to write a check? You know? We're walking through Genesis right now, the first book of the Bible, and we're looking at the story of Joseph, and the series is called Curveball. I don't know if you guys are baseball fans or not. I'm one of those guys that thinks that baseball is way more fun to play than to watch, okay? And so, but this series is called Curveball because Joseph gets curveball after curveball after curveball in his life. And so the question that we're asking in this series is this: what do you do when you get a curveball in life? And this week, Joseph gets another curveball. And this one might be the nastiest curveball of all. He's going to find himself utterly alone and in a pit again, and unable to hear from his father that loved him so much, or even God himself. Now, many people have read this story right here. They've read through Joseph's story, and they have been able to identify with this story. Because we've all of us, in some point in our life, have entered our own pit. Like Joseph, maybe we felt abandoned by the people that we trusted. You know, his very brothers were the ones that put him in the pit to begin with. Potiphar's wife, later on in the story, if you were here last week, you saw that she unjustly accused Joseph. And have you ever also been unjustly accused and your reputation or your integrity was unfairly attacked? We've probably all been there. The pit can represent times in our life whenever life feels deeply unfair. Have you ever been there? But I love this story because it meets us where we are and it helps us to get out of the pit. So last week we were in Genesis chapter 39. Today we're going to be in Genesis chapter 40. So if you got your Bibles, open up to Genesis chapter 40. But in Genesis chapter 39, Joseph, he is sold off. He is put in a pit only to be raised out of the pit, to be sold into slavery. And then tides turn, and he finds himself as a boss in charge of all of Potiphar's household, all of his fields. He's in charge of everything. But Potiphar's wife wants to take him to bed and finds him attractive, but he resists. She does the wrong thing. He does the right thing. And so what happens next in the story, right? If we're writing the story, we probably are going to send confetti down from heaven. You passed the test. Great job, Joseph. You resisted. Balloons are coming out. He's going to get rewarded. He's going to get blessed. But what actually happens? He does the right thing, but for the right, and she does the wrong thing, but he gets thrown into another pit. He gets thrown into a pit again. And look in Genesis chapter 40. I want to speed through the story a little bit, or past the story a little bit, all the way to verse 15. Then we'll come back and read the story. But look at what Joseph says about the pit. Look at what he calls the pit here. In verse 15, he says, I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in this dungeon, okay? And that word dungeon is interesting to me because that is the Hebrew word bor, B-O-R, bor. And it is the same word as if you go back to whenever he was put into the cistern. Remember that one in chapter 37? He was put into the cistern by his brothers into that pit. And guess what that word is? Bor. He is connecting the dots here. And he is saying, I am in the pit again. Here I am, found in the pit again. And he's making a connection here because he was in the pit to be brought out of the pit, and now he finds himself back into the pit. Have you ever been there? Now, I don't know if you knew this, but Joseph lost his mom when he was 8 years old. Imagine that. Losing your mom whenever you're 8 years old. And then he's got a father that loves him very much. And now, guess what? His brothers have ripped him away from his father. He's also lost his brothers as they have sold him off to being a slave. But there's one more thing about this that makes this really bad. Probably the worst thing about this. What else has Joseph lost? It's interesting. If you go back to Genesis chapter 12 and you look at Joseph's great-grandfather, Abraham. Abraham was called by God to go to a distant land. Do you remember this? So he leaves and he goes to a distant land. But what happens? God shows up here and God speaks to Abraham and he says, I'm going to be with you and I'm going to bless you. He speaks to Abraham before he leaves. Then you fast forward to Joseph's dad, Jacob. He is fleeing from his brother Esau, and he is going to a distant land. And what happens on the way? God shows up and gives him a dream, and he sees this dream of a staircase, and angels going up and down the staircase, and on the top of the staircase sat God, the Lord himself. And God said, Jacob, I'm with you, and I'm going to bless you. Now Joseph, he's seen this story happen before. His great-grandfather and his dad are going into a distant land. Now he's being carried off, not by any will of his own, right? And so he's being carried off into a distant land. So what do you think he might be expecting? Because isn't it nice that if you're going to be in the pit of life, isn't it nice that if you're going to go through trouble, that at least you hear from God, right? God's silent. He never shows up. He never speaks to Joseph. He never shows up and says, hey, it's okay. He never shows up and says, I'm with you. I'm going to bless you. Just hold on. He never does that. So Jacob has lost his mom. He's lost his dad. He's lost his brothers. Now, has he also lost the favor of God himself? I mean, talk about being in a pit. This guy is in a pit. And he feels utterly alone. Now, let's read some of the rest of the story. Here we go. In Genesis chapter 40, verse 1, it says this. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king greatly offended their master, the king of Egypt. Let me just stop right there. That word, the three words, sometime later, right? What does that make you think? Sometime later. To me, makes me think a few months, you know, I don't know, a season of time. That is almost a little bit deceptive because this sometime later is a decade. We know that he was 17 years old whenever he gets sold as a slave. We don't know how long he was in Potiphar's house in charge of everything. A couple years, maybe. I don't know. I'm kind of guessing a little bit there. But we know that in chapter 41, it says that whenever he finally gets out of prison, we know that he's 30 years old. A decade. He's lost his mom. He's lost his dad. He's lost his brothers. And he can't hear from God for a decade. Guys, man, I want to tell you, if you feel like you've been in a pit and you feel like it's been years and years, take comfort. This is your story right here. This is your story. Look at it. In verse 2, it says, Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. Do you guys remember who that is from last chapter? Do you remember who the captain of the guard is? That's Potiphar. Okay, so the jail, the prison was in Potiphar's house. That's what his job was, okay? So now these guys are in prison with Joseph. Joseph, remember what he used to be in charge of? He used to be in charge of Potiphar's house. He was up on the main floor in charge of everything, and now he is literally in the pit underneath the place where he was in charge of. I mean, that's got to mess with him too. This guy is going through it. And so then he says, in the same prison where Joseph was confined, the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. Now, we do see that Potiphar still pleasantly, he's got a positive outlook on Joseph because he still trusts him. He puts those prisoners in Joseph's care. Look in the next verse. It says, after they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, they had a dream the same night. Each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, so he asked Pharaoh's officials who were with him in custody, why do you look so sad today? He asked them, why do you look so sad? This little question is important. It's highly important to the story because this is the first moment that Joseph begins to climb out of his own grief. This is the first moment that he looks up and he notices somebody else. And he's now, for the first time, concerned about someone else. Have you ever noticed that when you are in pain, when you are in grief, so the best thing that you can do is to look and to serve? Because when you start serving someone else, even in your grief, it takes the focus off of your pain, and then you begin to notice someone else, their needs, and then you begin to address their needs. It gives you mission, and it gives you purpose back into your life. I want to encourage you, if you are in the pit, and if you are hurting right now, if you're in a tough place right now, sometimes the best thing that you can do is look up and see what other needs are out there and address those needs. This little question changes the whole aspect and the trajectory of his course out of the pit. And so he says to them, why do you look so sad? And then in verse 8, he says, we both had dreams, they answered, but there's no one to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, in my dream I saw the vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, and I squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I put the cup in his hand. This is what it means, Joseph said to him. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of prison. I was forcibly carried off from this land of the Hebrews. And even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in prison. This guy gets a positive interpretation of his dream. I'm sure he was ecstatic. He was thrilled with this. In 3 days, you're back. But I do find it interesting that the very first thing that Joseph does is whenever he sees that this guy is going to get out of prison, he finds a way to leverage it for his own benefit. He takes this good news that he has, and Joseph seems to immediately turn it to himself. And I don't think that's anything that we wouldn't do. I just noticed that Joseph is concerned about himself here, and so that might play into later in the story. And so look, in verse 16, he said, when the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, what's he going to say? He's like, hey, I had a dream too, right? And so he's going to say, interpret my dream. He's feeling good about this. And so he said, I had a dream. I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for the Pharaoh. But the birds kept eating them out of the basket on my head. And he said, this is what it means, Joseph said. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Right? Sounding good here. Same kind of thing. 3 days. Good. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head. You got to, wait, hold up. You meant lift up, like you said to the other guy, lift up my head. And you said, no, lift off your head. And it gets worse. He says, within 30 days, Pharaoh's going to lift off your head, and he's going to impale you on a pole. And then the birds are going to eat away your flesh. Now, I got to give it to Joseph. I think if we understood the dream and we had to break that news to somebody, we might sugarcoat that a little bit and say, it's not going to go well for you. Just let's leave it at that, man. But Joseph's like, hey, man, birds are going to pick your flesh off your body. Now, he does have some experience giving dream interpretations to people who don't want to hear it. He did that with his brothers, and he just shoved it right in their face and said, eat that pie, okay? Well, he does that to the baker right here. And so the baker hears that, and he says, now the third day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all of his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that he once again put the cup in Pharaoh's hand, but he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to him in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. And those last three words, he forgot him, just are haunting words for Joseph. He forgot him. His brothers sold him into slavery, and they wanted to forget him, and they would forget him till later in the story. And has God forgotten him now? He hasn't heard from God. And now he's got a little glimmer of hope here, and this guy, he forgets him too. Man, I don't know, but have you ever felt like that, where you felt forgotten? Maybe by people in your life that should have been close to you, that should have been taking care of you. Or maybe even you felt forgotten by God himself. Joseph certainly is in that spot right now. He was in the pit. So let's talk about that. Listen, I don't know if you've ever found yourself in what you would call a pit of life, but Joseph is in the pit, and here's the thing, God has allowed it. That's a tough one to swallow, isn't it? God has allowed it. There were several times in the text of Joseph's story where it said that God was with him. If you read the story, it said God was with him and he blessed him. God was with him. God was with him. So God obviously loves Joseph and even favors the Joseph, but so it begs the question, why the pit? Why would he let a guy that he loves, a guy that he even favors, go into a pit? And not even just once. He went once and had a terrible experience, and now he's back into the bore again. Why would God do that to us? Why would he allow that in our lives? And it's not even just for a time, but even a whole decade. Where is God in that? And the question has to be asked, is this just kind of a lost decade in Joseph's life? God wasn't ready for him yet, and so he just put him on hold for a little bit. Is that what's happening? Believe it or not, sometimes the pit is a good thing. Not only for Joseph, but maybe for us as well. Because when you're in the pit, you're someplace that you have lost control of things, and things are not going the way that you wanted them to. What is the number one thing that you're faced with in the pit? It's your own limitations. Have you ever noticed that sometimes the clearest that you have ever thought and the clearest you have ever seen was at rock bottom? Now, if you've never been at rock bottom, maybe you don't understand this, but if you've ever been there, you know what I'm saying, that sometimes the clearest that your mind has ever been is whenever you are rock bottom. And why? Why is that? It's simply because we're not giving answers anymore. We're asking questions. We are finally able to ask questions. When we have been giving statements, we have given blame, we have been saying things our whole life, but finally at rock bottom, we're finally asking those big questions. And because we're asking those questions, it humbles us. The pit humbles us, and it just strips away all the pride that gets in our way and that clouds our vision. And because of that, it gives us the proper perspective, and we can finally see what truly matters, and we start to put priorities where they actually go, at the bottom of the pit. That's why the pit can be good for us, because the pit can soften our hearts so that God can shape us. You guys understand that clay, you cannot shape the clay if it's hard. You can only shape it if it's soft, and if we will soften our hearts, God can start to shape us. Does God need to shape Joseph? I mean, Joseph's a pretty good guy here. My good friend Deborah Talent, she showed me how at the very beginning of his story, when it says that Joseph brought his father, at the very beginning of the story, Joseph brought his father a bad word about his brothers. That word, that bad word about his brothers, that word means slander. He wasn't just tattling on his brothers, which that's bad enough. He was actually slandering his brothers. You see that. And then, of course, we see that Joseph is favored by God. He's going to do great things, and so God gives him a dream that was meant for Joseph. But what does Joseph do? See, sometimes what's meant for just between us and God, it meant to be made public. But he took that dream and he shoved it in his brothers' faces. And he said, "You guys are going to bow down to me." God never intended that. And he shoves it in his brothers' faces. And then, of course, later we see that, whenever the cupbearer is going to be let out of prison, he immediately turns it on himself and says, "Hey, can you make this good for me? How can I leverage this?" Right? And he says this. And then there, in that verse 15, it's the verse that we started off the text with here. He says, in verse 15, he says this: "I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in the pit, in the dungeon." Nothing. And you're asking the question like, "Joseph, I know you're a good guy, but nothing? Nothing? Like when you were shoving this thing in their brothers' faces, nothing?" He is not, now listen, he is not the big reason that he's in the pit. The big reason that he's in the pit is the evil actions of other people. But he did play a small role in it. And until we're willing to ask the questions and be humbled and put proper perspective where it goes, right? Until that happens, sometimes we're not ready for what God has for us. God was going to use Joseph in a big way, but if he's going to be used for this big way, he's got to deal with his heart and even the small places of his heart. And so, even Joseph, has some work to do on his heart. The big question that Joseph has to answer is the question of this one. It says, "Who am I?" That's the big question. It's the same question that every single one of us in a pit must also answer. It's the question of, who am I really? Who am I? Am I the king of my life? Because the people who can take ownership of their decisions, big or small, those are the people who become better because of the pit. Have you ever noticed that some people become bitter and some people become better? That's why I started out by saying sometimes the pit can be a good thing. Because the pit is not always a good thing for everybody. It's up to us and how we respond to that. Some people will become better because of the pit, and some people will become bitter. God can do wonderful things in our hearts in the pit, so don't wish it away before God has a chance to do something in it. Man, I get it. All of us, we want the pit to go away. We want to get out of the pit, but if you'll just change one little prayer, just slightly, instead of "God, change my circumstances," to "God, change my heart," that will begin the ultimate transformation, and God will be able to use your experiences in the pit to bless somebody else later. I think one of the most interesting passages in the Bible is Hosea chapter 2. If you have your Bibles, I would really love if you turn there with me, because this is one that I think you'd want to underline, circle, highlight, whatever. Hosea chapter 2, verse 14 and 15. I love this verse. I go back to it over and over, and it says this: "Therefore, I," who's I? This is God. "I am now going to allure her." Who's her? Her is his people, Israel. Okay? We're going to find that in this book that God's people, Israel, has wandered away from him. They have wandered away, and he wants them back, and he wants to mold and shape their heart. So he says, I'm going to allure her, not to trick her, but to speak softly to her, gently, to shape her heart. Look, he says, therefore I'm going to allure her. I will lead her into the, what's the word? Wilderness. Now, who in here wants to be in the wilderness? The wilderness of life. The pit, if you will. None of us. But God says, I will allure her into the pit, into the wilderness, into the desert. Why? Why does God do that? And he answers the question right here. He says, and speak tenderly to her. Guys, it's so much easier to hear the whispers of God in the wilderness than it is in the busyness of the city. Man, sometimes God takes a time out for us. And if God has ever taken a time out in your life and you find yourself in the wilderness, start to listen, because many times God is whispering something at that moment. Look in verse 15. He says, there I will give her back her vineyards, and I will make the valley of Achor a door of hope. The valley of Achor, if you study that, is a valley where terrible things happened. And he's able to take the terrible things in life and turn even those things into good and wonderful things. I'm reminded of you guys remember those Cheez-It commercials? Where the wheel of cheese wants to go and do things, and the guy's, he's like, you're just not ready yet. Well, sometimes that applies to us in our hearts. Sometimes God has something for us, but he's got to do some work in our hearts first. And so we're not ready yet. Certainly that applied to Joseph. So don't wish away the pit before it has a chance to do its thing. My kids, did you guys ever have kids that whenever you were on a trip, what was the question that you got asked over and over? Are we there yet? I hate that question. It's so, and so I started answering it differently, and it ended the question. And so here's a pro tip for you parents. Here you go. Just say, I just started saying, yes, we're there. Oh, they get excited, and I said, we're just looking for a parking spot. Meanwhile, we're doing 80 miles an hour on the highway. I know you might be asking God, can we be done yet? But maybe God is doing something good in your life. See, the dilemma that faces all of us when we're in the pit of life is this: can you hold on? Can you hold on to our faith and to our confidence in God? Because not everybody does. Sometimes we lose confidence in God, and sometimes we lose confidence in ourselves. Sometimes we believe in God, but we don't believe that he believes in us anymore. But if we can find our confidence in God, it will settle our hearts. The NFL has come to a close here, and we saw some good games yesterday, and there's more today. But I don't know if you remember Super Bowl 23. That was when Joe Montana and the 49ers were playing the Cincinnati Bengals. I remember that one very well. And at the very end of the game, the 49ers found themselves down 16-13 with just over 3 minutes and 23 seconds left in the game, and they're on their own 8-yard line. Do you guys remember this game? And so they're sitting there, they're in a TV timeout, and Joe Montana and the team are all huddled up, and he said that the tension, you could have cut the tension with a knife. Everybody was nervous. It was do or die. This is it. We have to score now, or it's over for us. And so everybody's nervous, and Joe, he looks into the huddle, and he sees this, and to cut the tension, you remember what he said in the huddle? He looks over, and he points out to the stands, and he says, hey, look at that. You remember who? He said, it's John Candy. And everybody's like, what are you talking about, Joe? And he said, they started laughing in the huddle, and he said it eased the tension, and they were able to focus. And then, of course, they went all the way 92 yards, and with 34 seconds left, he threw a touchdown pass to John Taylor, and they won the game 20-16. Listen, when you're following somebody, if you have confidence in them, it changes your whole outlook. And when you're in the pit, it's easy to lose confidence. Confidence in yourself, but also confidence in God. So in those moments, here's what you do. In those moments when you're in the pit and you're losing confidence, look backwards. Look backwards. See what God has done in the past, and it will give you the confidence to do it again. Now, you're probably going to hear me say this again. This is a key thing in Scripture here. But I think it's helpful for us to walk into the future backwards. Now, one of my old pastors that I work for, Corey Landreth, he talks about this, but what we mean by that is this. When we're walking backwards, what are we looking at? We're looking at the past. We're looking at what has happened. And sometimes that is how Scripture tells us that God wants us to walk, because he wants us to focus on what he has done. And we all want God to show us our future, don't we? We want to see what's next, and we want to see far out into our future, what is God doing? But God says, I am a lamp unto your feet, not a high beams unto your highway, right? And so if we look this way, we see what God has done, and it gives us the confidence that if he has done it over and over and over, that whenever we turn over and look over our shoulder and we get glimpses of our future, the way that God kind of, how he operates for us, when we do that, we can have the confidence that that's going to be okay. Because God has shown up for his people over and over and over. And you're probably going to find out that, and you're probably going to see that God has showed up in your life over and over and over. If you find yourself in the pit, and if you can allow yourself to ask the hard questions of what God can teach me here, and if you can hold on to the confidence and your faith in God, if those things are true, you'll be better for it. And you will thank God for the pit later in your life. Something that you can't even imagine thanking God for right now while you're in the pit. And what's I think really interesting about this story is that Jesus' fingerprints are all over in this story. I don't know if you noticed it. But Jesus, whenever he died, where was he put? He was put into the pit for 3 days. And who raised him up out of that pit? God. God raised him up on the third day. And just as Joseph was put into that pit and he would eventually be raised by God, what would Joseph go on to do? He would go on to save many, many people. Just as Jesus, whenever he was raised up out of that pit, he would save many. And then, of course, you see who are the main players in this story. You've got the baker who bakes the bread, and you fast forward to the Last Supper, and, of course, the bread represents Jesus' body. And then you've got who else? The cupbearer who has the wine that represents Jesus' blood. Now, who is set free in this story? It's the cupbearer, the one with the wine. Why? Because it is by the blood of the Lamb that we are set free, isn't it? And what happened to the one that represents Jesus' body? It was hung on a tree. See, Jesus' fingerprints are all over this story. And I want to tell you this. Listen, I want you to be better because of your pit. I want you to come out of this thing better. But it doesn't matter if you don't have a relationship with Jesus. This whole thing is undergirded by Jesus' fingerprints saying, listen, nothing else matters unless you have relationship with me. So, the greatest thing that you could ever do in your pit is to look for Jesus and start there. Some of us, we've been trying to do it on our own. Even Joseph, get me out of this thing. He's trying to do it on his own. And maybe you've been looking for a way to leverage some kind of a spot in your life where you can take this thing by the handles and get yourself out of this thing. But I'm telling you what, man, maybe God has you there for a reason, and maybe it's just so that you'll ask him, hey, who am I? Guys, I want you to see your pits as something positive, something that God can do amazing things in your life. But most of all, resubmit your life to the Lord. Let me pray.